Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having us and listening to us. We're sorry we can't make it to Bochum. Our talk is about optimality and appeals to optimality in cognitive science, but we'll focus on Bayesian models. These kinds of appeals, as you can see from these titles, somewhat randomly selected, they're very common in the cognitive sciences. They're especially common perhaps in Bayesian cognitive science. And we want to ask, what exactly does an appeal to optimality contribute? And in particular, we can think about this in two ways or from two perspectives. First of all, does optimality or the appeal to optimality provide us with guidance in model building? So that's a kind of prospective thinking about how to build a model. And secondly, does optimality add value, in particular explanatory value, to a model, given that we've already constructed the model and we have some data with respect to it. Now, you could say quite a bit about what optimality exactly means, but we don't think that's especially important for our purposes. Basically, we have a kind of intuitive notion of optimality in mind, doing as best as possible, but doing as best as possible at some task. And given some constraints, that is usually at least implicitly presupposed when one makes an optimality claim. So that's the basic overall question. Here's a roadmap of the talk. We'll start with a couple of examples, one from perception, another from reasoning. We're assuming that some of the examples are likely to be familiar to many of you. Then we'll talk about three potential rationales for an appeal to optimality: a methodological rationale, an evolutionary rationale, and what we'll call an interpretational rationale. And we'll suggest problems for these rationales, concluding that number three, the interpretational rationale, is probably the most cogent, but that it doesn't obviously support optimality over weaker assumptions, what you might call reasonability assumptions, and we'll explain in more detail when we get there. Just to comment that some of the, as I sort of hinted at before, some of these claims are applicable to other contexts, possibly other contexts in which optimality plays a role, but definitely other cognitive contexts. But we'll focus on Bayesian cognitive models. That seems like a clear and more relevant case for present purposes. Okay. So here's a first example. Hopefully you can see this moving grating on the left. And if you'll notice, if you look at the cross or the dot, depending how far you're sitting from it, then if your gaze is focused at the cross, at the little black dot, then the image on the left appears to move slower than when you're looking directly at it. Right? It's a kind of it's an effect that you find in multiple contexts. And a well-known paper by Weiss et al. From 2002 examined a closely related phenomenon. What happens in their exact case is that objects moving in lower contrast conditions seem to move slower than in higher contrast conditions. And what they offer, essentially, we won't go into details here, but is a Bayesian model where the key idea is that we assign higher priors to lower velocities. And so when perception is noisy, like it is in low contrast conditions, the prior it affects the posterior more strongly, and you get this kind of effect where there's a sort of bias towards lower velocities. On the previous slide, we essentially saw the same effect. An uncertain information comes in, and the perception is sort of biased towards the prior. And Yael Weiss says of this and of some related effects that many motion, quote, illusions are not the result of sloppy computation by various components in the visual system, but rather a result of a coherent computational strategy that is optimal under reasonable assumptions. So that's one example of the kind of optimality thinking that we have in mind. Here's another example, likely also to be well known. This is an example from Battaglia, Hammerich and Tenenbaum, 2013. And they looked at simple physical scenarios, such as a kind of Jenga tower, a tower of bricks, where they ask whether, so here's a little video to illustrate this. Hopefully it'll work. Yeah, so you place a brick and you ask whether the tower will fall. This is not, as you'll notice, not quite from the experiment, but the experiment looked at how good people are at these tasks. And it's well known that in these kinds of tasks, people make errors, and more generally in tasks involving intuitive physical reasoning. And what Battaglia et al. Suggested, this can be explained as a use of approximate Bayesian thinking, taking account of the uncertainty in the inputs. And again, we'll not go into the details. The important point for our purpose is this is a rather different example from a kind of higher cognition or reasoning task compared to the previous perception task. But here too, they say something similar. They say these results show that people can incorporate into their predictions a key latent physical property that varies across objects, and that they do so in a near optimal manner. Here's some further examples that we won't go into, but in all of them, people's judgments are seen as close to the optimal prediction, or behavior is seen as an optimal solution to problems posed by the environment. So in the Bayesian context, the bottom line here is that we see a lot of these appeals to optimality, and it plays a role in the construction of the model and in the presentation of results. Now, in all of these cases, one could, at least in principle, do one of the following: either offer a mechanistic model, and one that's not structured, as a solution to an optimality problem. So for instance, in the case of the motion illusion, Thomson, who discovered this illusion, or thought of it, at least thought of it as an illusion back then, presented a two-channel model for velocity perception. The details don't matter too much, but it's not dependent on any optimality assumption, nor does it present the phenomenon, the effect, as a kind of optimal solution to any problem. In the case of intuitive physics, there are well-known heuristic models that were more popular in the 80s and 90s than they are today, I think, but they too are ones that do not present intuitive physical reasoning as in any sense optimal. So you could just offer a mechanistic model that is not structured as a solution to an optimality problem. It doesn't present the effect in optimality terms, or alternatively, one could offer the same model, but sort of forget about the fact that it is an optimality model. So essentially just give the results, test them, but not put any stress on the fact that there is optimality involved, and the effect is a kind of manifestation of an optimal perceptual or reasoning process. So the question really that we're asking is, why do what we've seen, these models that are presented or constructed and presented in optimality terms, rather than one or two, one of the, or both of the options on this slide? And we'll look at three rationales that one might have in mind. These rationales, we're thinking of them as distinct, but they're not necessarily in conflict with each other. The first, broadly speaking, is a methodological rationale. So essentially, it thinks of optimality as an aid to finding and constructing a model. The second is evolutionary, and in particular focuses on natural selection and on the idea that natural selection leads to optimal traits or optimal cognition in the present context. And the third is interpretational, and and that involves making sense of agents' behaviors as goal-oriented. We'll elaborate on all of these in a bit. I should say we're not sort of discussing whether these models are empirically adequate, how good their fit is with data. We're asking, given a particular model and data that might support it, what's the benefit of thinking in terms of optimality in this context? Okay, so the first rationale, as I said, is a methodological rationale. And the idea is that optimality helps us in basically finding and constructing a model, right? It's an important, we think, constraint often on the model construction, and it's often very important in terms of the formal methods that become available once you formulate a problem in terms of optimality. In many cases, we have formal methods, mathematical methods for solving for a maximum or minimum of some function, and this is a very good potential rationale for relying on optimality assumptions before we've constructed a model and as a means of coming up with a right model. Notice, though, that this kind of appeal to optimality does not in itself provide us with empirical support, and it's not meant to. The idea is we rely on optimality to formulate the problem, to provide us with formal methods for solving the model, and then those assumptions are in a sense irrelevant once the model is at hand and can be tested, right? So in this way of or motivation for appealing to optimality, it's kind of a ladder that can be kicked away once the model has been constructed. A second kind of rationale that I mentioned before, and I'll elaborate a little bit on now, is an evolutionary rationale. Here's a quote from a textbook by Ma, Cording, and Goldreich, which is, I think, about to come out any day now. And at one point, they describe the idea that many of Bayesian models are optimal, and they say, well, what justifies these kinds of appeals to optimality? And they say the argument would be that through evolution, presumably through natural selection, some common and important brain functions might to a large extent have been optimized. Therefore, it's likely that in some tasks, behavior close to optimal will be found. They add that this argument is more plausible for evolutionarily old functions, perception and movement, than for more recent functions, such as higher cognitive functions. So the basic idea is that natural selection is a kind of optimizing force. This is an idea that is common and seen across many contexts in which natural selection is appealed to. The idea is that at least if a trait is old enough, has had and makes enough of a difference to the organism's fitness, then natural selection could have brought it to or close to the optimum for that task. It's important to notice here that there's sort of two related roles for evolutionary considerations in this kind of thinking. One is it kind of provides an empirical motivation for building an optimal model. So the idea is we can expect the organism to be optimal or near optimal because of natural selection. You could also think that once you have a model, the fact that it's not only supported, let's presume, by data, experimental data, but also has an evolutionary kind of backing, all else equal, that sort of supports the model or makes it somewhat more plausible. So I'll just talk a little bit about this evolutionary rationale, and then Lotem will take over. We think this kind of rationale is, in principle, interesting and appealing, but it actually faces several quite significant challenges. The first has to do with the fact that many actual models in Bayesian cognitive science more generally, are approximations. The second has to do with the fact that natural selection doesn't always yield optimal solution. And the third is that we're not sure that many of the problems, many inference problems actually have the relevant kind of optimal solution. So let me just talk about the first and then hand over to Lotem. So many models, when you actually look at them somewhat more closely, many Bayesian models are actually involve approximation algorithms. So for instance, the example before, some of the examples, especially the example from intuitive physics that we gave before, actually relies on a kind of both an approximation of the Newtonian physics involved and a Monte Carlo based approximation of the Bayesian inference process. And that we think that's important in several respects, but in particular, it's important to notice that these approximations are drawn from engineering, from physics, from computer programming and computer science, cases in which the person designing the approximation has a pretty good idea of what the actual, the sought after solution is, right? It's an approximation in the sense that it's a kind of cheaper method of producing the desirable solution. That's okay if we're engineers or physicists trying to solve a problem, but it's not obvious that this kind of solution is what you'd expect if natural selection were the optimizing force, right? Natural selection famously is not a forward-looking process. It's not aiming to get near some target solution. So it's unclear, we think it's somewhat questionable that we should expect these kinds of approximations if we're thinking of the system as the product of natural selection rather than as the product of a kind of engineering project, as is the case in the disciplines from which these approximations are drawn. Now I'll hand over to Lotem.
Hi, okay, thank you, Arnon. We're right in the middle of describing three challenges for the evolutionary rationale. And Arnon talked about approximations, which we see a lot in the cognitive sciences, and describe why it's doubtful that evolution would lead to such approximations. The second challenge that I want to describe is actually a challenge that was thought about decades before we even began thinking about these questions. And that's the fact that while natural selection is an optimizing process, it need not lead to optimality because it's constrained by various factors. And just to give several short examples, so when we think about fitness and maximal fitness, it's not simply the addition of doing every possible task the best you can. It also depends on the interaction of different phenotypes. So being near optimal in a task, being performing it like an optimal Bayesian observer and doing the best you can in this task might not be optimal overall. Right. So first of all, it's a question of resources, and actually scientists have talked about this a lot. We need to ask how much resources the organism should dedicate to perform this task, and it's a very difficult question to answer. And secondly, it's a question of the interaction with other behaviors and capacities that the organism has. So Bayesian inference may not integrate well with other representations, right? It's just, we don't know. We don't think anyone has a concrete answer to this right now, but we're just posing it as a question within brain mechanisms. So it's not obvious that performing some task in a Bayesian manner with accurate priors and likelihoods is the best thing for the organism to do overall. And also importantly, related to what Arnon said before, selection isn't forward-looking. it doesn't choose the best available option. So if we think about fitness as a mathematical function and there's the best fitness for the organism, natural selection can't lead us there, right? It can maximize locally, which is a local maxima, which are not necessarily global. And just to give one famous example is the case of the human eye, where we know that the photoreceptors are at the back of the retina, where the light has to go through several layers of other neurons in order to reach them. And we think this is because of the evolutionary history. And this is the best that we got locally, even though it may not be the best global structure. So overall, the whole argument here is that while natural selection is a maximizing process, we should be very careful when we try to make an argument that it led us to a globally optimal solution for a specific task. And finally, the third challenge is that it's not clear to us that there are well-defined optimal solutions to inference problems. So what do we mean by this? Consider the case of the visual illusions from the paper that Arnon described by Weiss et al. And they say there that this is a near optimal Bayesian model, which has a higher prior for lower velocities, presumably because things usually tend to stand still and not move very quickly. Okay, let's say that we accept this argument, but there's still a very big open question about how should we think about the prior that people use and what is the best prior. Should we use all previous velocities in my history? Should my reference point be all previous velocities on screens? Should it be all previous velocities during the last year? I don't have a principled way to choose either of these, and we can make a possibly strong claim. I think I'm making this a claim more than Arnon is, that there is no strictly better answer. There is no, when we think about fitness, it's not clear that there is one optimal solution that will maximize fitness from the point of view of the organism. But even if you do believe that from these options and many more options, there is one prior that the organism should choose, I think you must accept that it's very hard for scientists to know the correct answer. So when I say that people solve something optimally, it's really not clear how we can relate it to fitness maximizing. So even if you believe that there is an optimal solution, the fact that scientists have a very hard time recognizing what is optimal should cast doubt on the evolutionary rationale supporting these types of models. So just to sum up the whole evolutionary rationale, I think there is general sense in saying that natural selection is maximizing, and in some cases it may lead to optimal solutions. But we do need to be very careful when we consider specific cases, because it's not clear that if there is an optimal solution that we can identify it, that we should expect natural selection to lead to it. And moreover, when people use approximations, that we should expect natural selection to use these approximations. And this leads us to the third rationale for appeals to optimality. We take it that a defining aim of psychological science is to understand subjects as agents with aims that they seek to attain, given costs and constraints. So we can think about this as a modest form of instrumental rationality, right? In order to understand other people, we have to think that there is some reasonableness to the way they behave. If we want to understand them as people, as agents, and not just as physical objects. So just to give some quotes relating to this rationale, this is from Stitch, The Fragmentation of Reason. Intentional description requires the disposition to draw some reasonable subset of the inferences that would be expected of an ideally rational cognitive agent. Right? If we want to describe some system as intentional, as having intentions, as being an agent, we need to assign them some level of rationality, or we can be less strict and talk about reasonableness. Karayanni and Elkin, these are scientists, just to describe something of the scientific intuition around this idea. So this is what they say. Behaviors that are apparently non-optimal can be interpreted as the consequence of optimal decisions, whose goal is to optimize a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. So basically they say what we want to do, if we see non-optimal behaviors, we want to think about how we can characterize them as optimal, right? And they don't say this in the paper, but what we infer from this is by doing this, this allows us to view the organisms as intentional, reasonable systems, rather than ones that are just arbitrarily mistaken. So we take it that optimality has perhaps even an explanatory benefit, because it allows for an explanation of people as agents. So let me get more into this a little bit. Consider the case of visual illusions of velocity. So we can give different explanations to this phenomenon, right? We can describe a physical property of the brain causing inaccurate perception. This is a bit similar to what Thompson did. It's just the case that there is some bias in some part of the mechanism. We can describe some evolutionary history leading to limits in perception, right? We can say something about the history. Because of this history, we get these illusions. Oh, we can say that these illusions are part of an optimal model involving prior expectations. And we take it that only the third option explains the system as an agent, right? So the other systems, the other types of explanations that we can give describe the system maybe as a biological system, as a physical system, but not as an agent that has some purpose to their behavior. And here, I think we can think about the principle of charity, right? So to understand other systems, as agents, specifically people, we want to be charitable in the interpretation that we assign their behaviors. We don't want to say they just behave randomly, they're just making mistakes. We want to think that maybe there are reasons and beliefs for why they behave the way that they do. And specifically, we're in a conference about Bayesian reasoning. So we think that when we think about Bayesian models, they're actually a great tool to do this, right? Because they can take the behavior and they can tell you what are the priors and likelihoods, what are the beliefs of the person or system that you're modeling that can explain this behavior in a charitable way, that can make sense of this behavior. So Bayesian modeling allows for this charitable interpretation of systems behavior. What about intuitive physics? So in intuitive physics, we're talking about reasoning, right? So when describing reasoning, it's actually very difficult to consider explanations that do not describe the system as even possibly mistaken agents, right? So I can think about people using heuristics for intuitive physics, as Arnon described before. They're still agents. Maybe they're making not optimal choices, but they still have certain beliefs and they act on these beliefs. We can say maybe people believe in other types of physics, Aristotelian physics. They just have a mistaken model of the world, which explains their behavior. They're still agents, right? It's very difficult to think about explanations of these types of behavior, reasoning behaviors that do not assign intentional thinking and reasoning to people. And here a question comes to mind. So these interpretations that we give people, they can describe them as reasonable to a varying extent. So how reasonable should we explain people as? How committed should we be that people have accurate models, that they behave accurately according to these models? And we leave this as an open question. So some challenges to the interpretive rationale. First of all, we think it's very important to point out that viewing others as agents is a perspective, right? It is not empirically mandated, as evolutionary rationales may suggest. So you can see in papers, maybe we identify that people are optimal. And there are two ways to interpret this claim. One would be there is some fitness maximizing function, and this is what we identify that people do. But we think that the challenges for evolutionary rationales lead us away from this interpretation. And what we should actually say is we want to describe people as agents, and we found a way to do this. And this is a weaker claim than the one about evolution, and we should be aware that it's a weaker claim. Moreover, it's important to keep in mind that agents don't need to be optimal. They don't need to perform the task perfectly, right? Or as best as possible. We only expect when we look at people around us, for them to make reasonable choices relative to a reasonable belief model that we assign to them. Finally, and this is also an open question to us, what are the limits of this perspective, right? So how reasonable should we expect people to be? It's not, it's very difficult to draw this line. And also, we know we want to describe people as reasonable, but should we describe perceptual systems as reasonable? What is the benefit to this? And there is a worry that when we are overextending this perspective, we might involve a self-congratulatory bias. We want to think of ourselves as optimal, reasonable, making good choices, and not think of ourselves as limited by our physical construction or by our history. So this is something to keep in mind when we use this interpretational rationale, when we think about how we want to interpret these systems. Okay, that's it. So to conclude, we believe that methodological reasons are cogent. It's great to have a model with where you have a clear solution, you can solve it mathematically, and you can give clear predictions. But if this is your rationale, then there's no reason to talk about optimality post hoc, right? It's just a reason to construct an easily constructible model. Evolutionary rationales, they face severe challenges. In our view, we should not assume them a priori. It may be for specific cases that we can say that natural selection indeed led to optimality, but we cannot just say that what people do right now is optimal because of natural selection. Finally, interpretational reasons reflect a strong tendency to view others as reasonable agents. We believe these motivations are likely to be the strongest motivator in modeling people as optimal. We think it's very compelling that we want to think about others as reasonable agents. But it's important to keep in mind that the optimality in question is not evolutionary. It's about making sense of others' behavior as reasonable. And in this sense, it's a weaker claim about optimality. That's it. Thank you very much.